Welcome, everybody, to another webcast, Wireless Works, sponsored by Cambium Networks. My name is Daran Hermans. I'm a product manager in the Enterprise Business Unit at Cambium Networks. I'm glad to be here and be your host today. We're talking about broadband, we're talking about education, we're talking about kids at school, kids at home, and how they can get access to broadband at home to do things. Claude, let me ask you a question here. Why should we be talking about this today?
Well, this has been a problem that we've known about for a while, this problem called the homework gap. And this is a problem that means effectively that students who either have lack of access to broadband at home due to geographic or other challenges, or they have access, but they can't afford that connectivity. And historically, that's meant that they've had to find other avenues to gain access to that connectivity, to do their homework, to drive to a spot where there's a free Wi-Fi access point. The COVID-19 hit, and that homework gap turned into a education chasm. No longer was it about you can't do your homework and you have to find a way to do it, but all of the learning that had been done in the classroom now moved online, and you're being left even further behind because of your lack of connectivity. And that's the problem that we're talking about today.
Wow. Okay. So we've been doing this COVID thing for, seems like forever, but it's only been about 16, 17 months. So give me some good news. Have we done any positive things?
We've done a lot of positive stuff, and we really have to take hats off to the school districts that really have done amazing work to tackle this problem early on in the pandemic, as well as some of these really entrepreneurial and innovative internet service providers who have done amazing work quickly deploying broadband to homes that haven't had it, standing up free community access points, really doing amazing work to deploy broadband, to stand up affordable programs for students and families who may not have been able to afford a full freight cost broadband connection. But a lot of work yet to do.
Sure, I can see that. So Claude, you have a lot of knowledge here. Let's go ahead and introduce you. Your title is President and CEO of Wispa. Wispa, for those who don't know. If you come from the enterprise space like I do, you're not going to know what Wispa is. So I'll tell you what it is. It's the Wireless Internet Service Provider Association. So tell us a bit about what is Wispa?
Sure.
What
So
are you doing there?
as you said, Daran, Wispa is the trade association that represents entrepreneurial and innovative internet service providers, primarily folks who have historically used fixed wireless connectivity to quickly and affordably build out connections to folks who either haven't had good connectivity in the past, or to provide a competitive option to folks who may have ability to access broadband, but maybe it's too expensive. So as you said, I'm president and CEO of Wispa. We have about close to 1,000 members across the United States and the world. A little bit about me. I spent about a decade at the FCC before coming aboard this, and that really gave me kind of an exposure to all of the policy problems that we're trying to address related to connectivity writ broad, as well as the specific topic that we're talking about today, which is the homework gap.
Wow. Yeah, and you talked about that homework gap. You mentioned earlier, you said, there's this huge impact. You mentioned that the homework gap has transitioned into an education gap due to COVID. So what's been happening? If you go back, this problem was not new. It didn't happen just last year. It probably happened, years before. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do here as far as planning to go forwards, Claude? We know there's a problem. Let's move on. Let's find a solution. What do we need to do looking forward?
Sure. So as I mentioned previously, some of the problem was related to deployment, and some of it was related to adoption. And the adoption problem has been pretty multifaceted. Some folks don't have, as I mentioned previously, some folks were not able to necessarily afford the connection to the home. Some didn't have the necessary tools within the home, either computers or other things to be able to utilize it. And some folks historically haven't seen the relevance to adopting connectivity at home. And while that last piece, the relevance was really put into sharp relief during COVID, and we saw a lot of folks who historically had not adopted broadband really saw the relevancy, especially when their kids had to learn from home full time. Some of those other problems were a little bit more tricky to tackle. And one of the big things that we saw during COVID was a lot of government funding being deployed to address both the deployment and the adoption gap, and really make sure that we weren't caught off guard by something like this ever again, to really reconstruct the entire education environment, collaboration between service providers, between school districts, and really the recognition that resources needed to be provided outside of the 6 to 8 hours a day that students are inside the school building, to really ensure that there's a continuous learning fabric that goes throughout the student's entire life.
You just use a phrase there. I want to get you to explain that to me. You said the education environment. And you also talked a lot about the residential home up to that point. So you just introduced two things. You have the resident, which we understand. I have a son who's 14 years old. You know, he was at home all last year. So I understand the home environment. What's this education environment? What sort of things are encompassed in that?
Sure. So I think really what we've seen, especially to address some of this deployment gap, we've seen a lot of other institutions beyond just the school get involved here to really address that connectivity gap that's been so critical to learning over the course of the past 17 months. You've seen, schools jump in. You've seen libraries, churches, community centers, providing that kind of connectivity for folks who may not have been able to have that connectivity at home. And then also to assist service providers in deploying that connectivity. So one of the great stories that I heard even just this earlier this year at one of our trade shows was the pastor of a local church who showed up to a wireless internet trade show, and I was talking to him, and he was telling me about how he had utilized the steeple on his church to deploy some wireless gear and be able to provide low-cost connectivity into a community that didn't have it before. To be able to allow these parents to work from home, these students to learn from home. We just, over the course of the pandemic, I think people got a lot more creative about utilizing the resources that they had to be able to address this critical issue, to enable students to continue to be able to learn amid all of the challenges that they were facing.
I like that story. That's neat because, the Middle Ages, the church steeples were the tallest building in town. Today, they're oftentimes the tallest building in a certain neighborhood, right? So they can actually, it's a great part of that infrastructure. And that is part of infrastructure because it does require that. So wireless internet service providers, not just an internet service provider, they're using wireless technology to actually bring broadband data to each one of these points you're talking about. You talked about
Absolutely.
residential. So they're dropping in that broadband data over wireless to a home. They're dropping it to a community center, dropping it to a library, churches, schools. So they're able to use wireless technology to get these links out there, turn them up really quickly. So that's a lot of infrastructure. That's a lot of work. Now, I think that it's going to take, you mentioned a lot about these entrepreneurial wisps. So it takes they're going to have to, they provide, the brain power, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Brain power and people power to actually get out there and get this done.
It does. And I did talk to a Wispa late last year as well. In 2020, there's similar stories that you've been seeing as well, where they actually partner with schools, put up a tower on top of the school, run their shots out to homes that were served by that elementary school in Illinois, and then able to bring all that data back on a VLAN tied to the school, so that essentially the homes became an extension of the school. Great application. It doesn't work for everybody, but perfect application for him. I also talked to some others down in Texas that were deploying little hotspots on school buses. So these 20 passenger, 40 passenger school buses, not the 40s, but the small ones, the 20 passenger ones, outfitted with a couple of access points, drive up to a hotspot. So creative, they're entrepreneurial, but they're also creative. They're hardworking people. They need some support though. They need something else. And so what is the government doing? What sort of government tools do we have to help out, to get those guys help they need?
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the tools that the government has historically excelled at providing is funding. And we've seen a lot of that being pushed into the marketplace over the course of the past year. Through the CARES Act, some of the earlier legislation that was adopted to provide funding to address some of the issues with the pandemic, as well as the American Rescue Plan that was adopted earlier this year, that created a couple of key funds to address the homework gap. One of which was the $7.2 billion emergency connectivity fund, which was run through the FCC. Has been targeted to school districts to meet those kind of connectivity needs in their community. We actually just got some news last week after the first funding window closed. Only $5.1 billion were asked for out of that. So the FCC is going to be opening another funding window to see what the need is after that funding is used. So that again is kind of on the deployment side of the equation. What kind of gear do we need to get into the field to be able to meet these connectivity needs? The other piece of the American Rescue Plan was more targeted at the affordability piece of the equation, which is the emergency broadband benefit, $50 a month discount on connectivity, as well as some support for devices in the home. We've seen over the course of the past few months, as that program has been stood up, millions of Americans taking advantage of that. And that's just the ones that are kind of more targeted towards that. There have been funding through NTIA, for tribal broadband, for communities of color, HBCUs, community colleges to take advantage of that, as well as generalized infrastructure funding through the Department of Treasury. We're just seeing all sorts of funding programs pop up to address this critical gap that we're seeing.
You just expanded my thinking a little bit there, because when we started this conversation, I was thinking of my own son, right? I was thinking of middle school,
Right.
high school,
Right.
Elementary school, and that's easy for us to think about. It's because all parents, that's what we're thinking about. But then as the kids get older, they're going to go off to community colleges, universities. So this is bigger than just high school, isn't it? It's bigger than just
it's bigger than high school or my kids who are in elementary school. It's bigger than all of them, and
Yeah.
it really is. And it kind of goes back to what, we're talking about the homework gap here, but that really is, it's a critical piece of this gap. But, you think about seniors who are trying to age in place and their access to telehealth, farmers who are trying to utilize precision agriculture. I mean, the government is trying to look at this holistically. And while we see tranches of funding dedicated to particular verticals here, really and I mean, we may talk about this a little bit later, but this is all even happening in the context of a massive $1 trillion plus infrastructure bill, which also has broadband funding in it as well. So the last word has not been written on what government is trying to do here.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're kind of expanding my thinking a little bit here too, because it's often been said that internet is a utility. It's like, it's like electricity and water. You really can't live without it. And then you mentioned some applications like farmers. Those are infrastructure, and so yeah, it makes sense that it's part of the infrastructure bill. So what? And I know the infrastructure bill is tied up in Congress right now. It hasn't been passed or signed into law yet. But what are some of the numbers that are in that particular bill?
Sure. So at a high level, it's over $1 trillion bill that is really a comprehensive look at what our infrastructure needs as a nation are. Now, in this podcast, we're talking about connectivity, so let's zoom in on that one a little bit. We're talking overall a spend of about $65 billion on connectivity writ large, and the biggest chunk of that is to address the deployment gap to areas that don't have 25 by 3 broadband today. We're going to try to get that to 100 by 20 broadband or better. And Congress is, at least in the bill that passed the Senate, is allocating $42 billion to address that gap, to get broadband to every home in the United States.
Something we should be paying attention to then.
Absolutely.
So now you're throwing out some numbers there. You said currently 25 by 3, that's 25 megabits down, 3 megabits per second up.
Correct.
Moving to 100 megabits per second down, 20 megabits per second up, and then even higher. So now earlier in this conversation, we talked about wireless ISPs using wireless technology to deliver broadband. Is this still possible? Can wireless technology today deliver that kind of 100 by 20 that you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. Wireless can do that today, utilizing gear that's currently in the marketplace, and that is something that we at Wispa did a lot of work to try to educate policymakers to say, hey, if you leave wireless out of the equation here, your consumers are going to be worse off at the end of the day. It's going to take longer to get broadband out there, and as we've seen over the course of the pandemic, connectivity delayed is connectivity denied. And you're also taking one of the most affordable ways to deploy out of the equation there. So we did a lot of work over the course of the past year trying to educate lawmakers on the benefits of wireless and fixed wireless in particular, in the ability to quickly and affordably close that not only the homework gap but the broader connectivity gap in the nation.
So in terms of this is where, Claude, I'm weaker in this area because I come from the enterprise space. I'm so glad I'm at Cambium because I get exposed to so many new technologies and acronyms that I get to learn, like Wispa, a new acronym. But there's a lot of technology. When we say wireless broadband, now that's a word. I know what that word wireless means. I might think about wireless in terms of what's in my home, 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, but is that what sort of scope? What is the breadth of the scope of technology? And I'm setting you up here just to let you talk about this, but what is the breadth of the scope that these wireless ISPs have in their toolbox that they can utilize to deliver broadband at, whatever it is, 200 meters to 500, 600 meters? What sort of tools do they have to work with?
Sure. So I think on a consumer level, that's you're right. That's exactly what you think of for wireless. You think of your Wi-Fi router in your home, delivering a signal to all of the many devices that you have. Now, WISPs or wireless ISPs use similar technology, but the connectivity is from your home to an access point, what we kind of colloquially refer to as the last mile. And sometimes that's the last few hundred feet if you're using a particular higher frequency spectrum band, or it could be the last several miles if you're using lower band spectrum. But the mechanics of how that typically work is you'll have a receiver on your home and a receiver on a tower or another elevated piece of infrastructure that we were kind of talking about earlier. And it's kind of like fiber, but over the air. You have high-speed connectivity that's beamed into your home, which then gets distributed throughout your home using what a consumer would typically understand as your wireless connection inside the home.
Okay, so you mentioned the higher frequency stuff. So it's you mentioned different frequencies. So it's not really this is not a technology. They're not using your home Wi-Fi technology. So they're using specific work that's things that are specifically designed for the application. It's not going to, is it going to interfere? I guess the question is it going to interfere with my Wi-Fi inside the home?
The way that it's typically designed, no. You're in a lot of cases, you're using different technology, and in some instances, even different bands of wireless spectrum to be able to talk in ways that don't interfere with each other, right? So while you may use a 5 gigahertz band inside the home, a WISP will typically design that network setup, even if they're using a 5 gigahertz unlicensed band to provide that connectivity from your home to the tower. It's different equipment. It's utilized in a different way, and if it's all set up correctly, you're not going to experience any degradation either from the home to the tower or inside the home.
Great. Well, that's a little bit of tech talk. I appreciate the little dive on that. I do appreciate that. So let's wrap this up a little bit. We talked about some 3 different groups of people that are going to be involved in closing this education gap. Obviously, the schools, the educators, the community centers, the higher education, that's part key. They're key. We talked about entrepreneurial and creative WISPs that are going to provide the feet on the ground. They're going to do the designs, the deployments. We talked about the role that government has in providing funding and policy and guidance to this industry. So those are 3 key pieces. So where does that entrepreneurial WISP, if those folks are listening to this webcast today, is there any tips that they might need to know to take advantage of some of this funding opportunities?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I really love about this innovator ISP space is that these are folks who really know networks, and that is their focus, and that's why they've been able to excel during this pandemic in quickly providing connectivity to folks who critically need it. I think folks, my message to folks who are trying to figure out what the next steps are is you need to spend a little bit of time away from building the network and talking to folks in government. You need to make some time to do that, and where that may make the most impact is talk to your state broadband office. A lot of states have those now. Talk to your state and local political representatives. Talk to your representatives in Congress, and just tell them who you are. Tell them what you're doing. and tell them what more you could do if you had access to better spectrum, had access to some of this funding that's coming down the pike, and ask them for guidance on how to do that. Because I know a lot of smaller ISPs, they got their growth from from bootstrapping. Effectively, you take the revenue you get from providing service and you pour that back into the network. What we're seeing coming down the pike now and into the future is generational amounts of government money that is going to be spent on broadband. So engaging with your state broadband office, engaging with your federal, state, and local representatives, telling them who you are, asking them how to gain access to this funding. That's going to be critical going forward, just to let them know you're there, because these are busy people, and if you don't educate them, as we at Wispa are trying to do on a national level, educating them on the local level is the only way that you are going to be part of the equation in their mind, and part of the solution going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point you make there, because it's going to be a two-way street, Claude. You're going to be looking. The WISP should be looking to those regulators and legislators for guidance and policy and what their planning is. At the same time, they're going to be looking to you as a WISP, as a subject matter expert, and saying, what do you think? They're going to ask you, what would you do if we did such this and that and the other thing? So it's an opportunity really for both sides, because this is a collaborative effort. I mentioned those three groups of people, and it's going to take close cooperation. So that's a great advice you just gave all. I appreciate that. Well, Claude, I learned something today. I learned some new things. I learned about generational money that is being spent. I've learned about this engagement of the policymakers, as well as some stuff about technology. Wireless ISPs have a key role in closing this education and homework gap. So I thank you for your time today, and I thank everyone for joining us, and look forward to another Wireless Works from Cambium Networks.